minute. Good afternoon. I'm Hale Esfandiari. I run the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I would like to welcome you to today's meeting on resolving regional conflicts, the Western Sahara, and the quest for a durable solution. This is the first in a series of meetings focusing on recent development in the Maghreb countries regarding Western Sahara. So today, and I'm repeating it, this is the first in a series of meetings through the year. Today's session will focus on the Western Sahara issue and the quest for a durable settlement. We are fortunate to have with us three top experts in the field. For those of you who are here for the first time, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars was established in 1968. It is a non-partisan center which aims to unite the world of ideas with the world of policy by supporting preeminent scholarship and linking that scholarship to issues of concern to officials in Washington. Congress established the center as the official national memorial of President Wilson. Whenever we talk about President Wilson, we say that he's the only president with a PhD and with a university career. The center is a non-partisan institution, and for our meetings, we invite a diverse group of speakers and present a variety of views. The views expressed at our meetings are not the Wilson Center's views. Before I introduce our speakers, let me say a few words about the Middle East program. The program began in 1998. In addition to spotlighting day-to-day issues, it continues to concentrate on long-term regional developments and their impact on political and social structure, economic development, and relations of the countries in the MENA region with the United States. The programs pay special attention to the role of women, youth, civil society, institutions, Islam, and democratic and autocratic tendencies. And roughly every year we host around 60 meetings. Our speakers today are Professor Lopez Garcia, who is a professor of history of contemporary Islam in the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies at the Autonomous University of Madrid. He is the author of several books on politics, elections, and social movements in the Maghreb. He was a researcher at the International Mediterranean Studies Workshop at the Autonomous University of Madrid and maître de conférence at the University of Fez in Morocco from 1974 to 76 and 80 to 83. Professor Lopez will go first. When he starts speaking, we would like you to use your headsets for those of you who don't speak Spanish. Our second speaker is Ms. Anna Theophilopoulos, who is a political analyst and writer. Currently, she's senior advisor to the Refugee and Immigrant Fund assisting asylum seekers on their way to legalization in the United States. She's a former UN official with work experience on political and development issues. She has covered North Africa, in particular the conflict over Western Sahara, Central and West Africa, and the Middle East. She has worked closely as advisor to former US Secretary of State Jim Baker III throughout his good office's mission as personal envoy of the Secretary General on Western Sahara from March 1997 until his resignation in 2004. And the discussant of today's meeting is our colleague, Dr. Marina Ottaway, who is a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center and a longtime analyst of political transformation in Africa, the Balkans, and the Middle East. She's working on a project at the Wilson Center about the countries of the Arab Spring and Iraq. Dr. Ottaway joined the Wilson Center after 14 years at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, during which she played a central role in launching the Middle East program. A fantastic gain for us, a big loss for Carnegie. Prior to that, she carried out research in Africa and in the Middle East for many years and taught at a number of universities, including Georgetown and Johns Hopkins and the American University in Cairo. She taught at the university in Zambia and Addis Ababa University. Her extensive research experience is reflected in her publications, which are numerous, and we have circulated a longer bios. You can pick them up on your way out today. The panelists today will provide an insight and analysis of conflict reduction scenarios for the Western Sahara issue, including but not limited to the autonomy plan introduced by Morocco. Each of the speakers and the discussant have roughly between 15 to 20 minutes to make their presentation. Then I will open the floor to the three speakers. They can comment on each other's presentation also, or ask each other questions, and we will then open the floor. We will only allow questions, and we will not accept comments, because there will be numerous questions, and I would like to cover all the questions that are put to the speakers. So I'm very strict with this approach. So forgive me if you make a comment, I'm going to cut you off. So it's going to be questions only. Professor Lopez, you can sit here with.
Buenas tardes. Primero, agradecer al Wilson Center por esta invitación que me permite, sobre todo, exponer un punto de vista académico, pero al mismo tiempo un intercambio de pareceres con mis colegas y también con el público. En segundo lugar, pedir disculpa al auditorio por
to the entire audience, as I will be giving my presentation in Spanish. Let's just say it's a way for me to express myself clearly. I would not be able to do that in English. We are looking at a conflict that has lasted 38 years and for which we see no way to resolve it. The Polisario Front, since it was founded in 1973, has been demanding the independence of the Western Sahara, and it is asking for a self-referendum, or a referendum for self-determination, which did not take place in 1975 under the colonizing power, nor under the UN since 1999-91, when a peace plan was signed among the parties. Morocco controls the northern part of the territory since 1975 and the southern part since Mauritania withdrew in 1979. And it is firm in its idea that this is land that historically belongs to Morocco, and during this whole time it has sought to delay matters in order to not modify annexation and be able to prolong its presence and control of the territory. The Polisario Front is comforted by the fact that international legitimacy tends to favor it, recognizing that there's a decolonization process that did not conclude. Morocco is ambiguous in its position. It accepts the idea of negotiating with the Polisario Front to find a solution, which indicates that they realize it's a problem that has not been resolved. However, officially, and before public opinion in the country, its discourse demonizes their adversary and never questions the Moroccan nature of the territory. Morocco did a partial reading of the decision by the International Court of Justice of The Hague in 1975 and launched the Green March. Today is the 38th anniversary. In Hassan II's speeches, in the messages that he had to mobilize his people, and these are still repeated today, this decision by the Court of The Hague was seen as a success by Morocco, since the court recognized certain links between the Moroccan Sultan and certain Sahrawi tribes, but they consciously omit, and still do, they still omit the other part of the decision, where the court said that those links were not indicative of legal links in terms of territorial sovereignty over the Western Sahara by Morocco, and it was still necessary to apply the principle of self-determination. So this discourse has dominated in Morocco for 38 years, and it's conditioned almost everything in its foreign relations to the defense of what it considers to be its territorial integrity. Years after the war, after treaties that were signed and processes where the population was to identify itself and be a part of a census, of maneuvers where thousands of non-native people were transferred into the territory, of failed proposals for solutions by the special envoy of the Secretary General of the United Nations, of rounds of negotiations sponsored by the UN. The situation is still at an impasse, unresolved, while there are between 40 and 150,000 people as refugees living outside of the territory for 4 decades in precarious conditions, depending on humanitarian aid, in camps outside in the Tindouf region in the south of Algeria. Since the end of 2000, the resolutions by the Security Council of the UN, the reports by the Secretary General and others have insisted that no solution would be found to the problem unless the Moroccan government were willing to offer or support the restitution of some government functions to the inhabitants and former inhabitants of the territory, and this measure should be genuine, substantial, and abide by international law. Morocco took until April of 2007 to offer an autonomy plan that headed in this direction, but in the 6 years that went by after that plan was introduced, it's still on paper. It has not been implemented because no effective provision has been adopted to allow for the participation of the original population of the territory to participate in political life and economic life. And it's a very different environment there than in the cities of Morocco. There are frequent violations of human rights, especially towards those inhabitants who are natives of the Sahara, if they express any idea against the official thesis of Morocco. The Polisario Front has based its strategy against Morocco on reporting at international fora these persistent violations, and it is asking the UN mission that deals with this MINURSO to exercise its oversight for human rights in the territory. Morocco believes that this is an interference in its internal matters, and there was a recent proposal by the US in the Security Council. It did not conclude, and they wanted to give this power to MINURSO. The autonomy plan that was made public by the Security Council of the UN in 2007 proposed some novel aspects, such as the idea that the Sahara populations would manage their own matters democratically through a legislative, executive, and judicial branch of government. It referred to the election of a president through a parliamentary assembly with broad administrative, economic, social, and cultural powers. It promised a general amnesty, excluding any kind of persecution or intimidation of those who supported the other party, and it proposed negotiating the powers of autonomy, establishing limits such as sovereignty, limits on a monarchic institution, etc. And these would be constitutionalized as a guarantee for the population. But since 2007, no steps have been taken in this direction. And there was a process that took place during the first years of the Arab Spring. And here an opportunity was missed out on, an opportunity was lost to open up a great national debate on this matter, which is key for the future of the country. But this has become a taboo in the country. The new constitution of July 1st, 2011, took one modest step forward, recognizing the Saharo-Hassani component, identity component, as an integral part of the Moroccan cultural identity, and it proposed preserving that language as one of the as a part of Morocco's linguistic inheritance. But it continues to define the political system as an executive monarchy. It rejects demands for a parliamentary monarchy. Neither Morocco's civil society, nor its political parties, and nor its royal power have mentioned the Sahara in the 100 days of the constitutional debate. This would have been the opportunity to offer guarantees to the other side in the conflict that there was going to be an effective decentralization of the country, limiting the presence of the walis or governors who depend directly on royal authority, and providing a new territorial structure that would allow for the possibility of establishing a genuine and authentic autonomy for a region such as the Sahara. What's more, the specific ban on forming regional political parties has made it impossible to democratically channel the political currents that are seeking to present various proposals to solve the problem, including the option of independence. These currents now have no way to express themselves politically. The recent visit of Christopher Ross to the Western Saharan territory shows this. We understand the mistrust of the Polisario Front. They see no guarantee that this possibility for autonomy promised in 2007 will ever become a reality. And this problem in the Sahara, for 38 years, has depended on these people in the Western Sahara feeling recognized as the first citizens of their own land, able to have their own destiny in their own hands and living in harmony with their Moroccan brothers and sisters. But I don't think this is what is happening. I think there is a problem in the Sahara in terms of living together. There are more than 100,000 Moroccans who in the 90s were transferred and settled in this territory in order to manipulate the census of the Sahrawis who were going to vote in the self-determination referendum. They are now twice as many as the native population. They live in very difficult conditions, even though they receive monthly allowances from the state. And among the young people, this has truly had an effect on them, and they have had encounters, violent encounters with the native population, and there have been victims. And there's also infighting among different factions of the political power. And this was seen in the dramatic episode in the Dimzik camp in November of 2010. Among the obstacles today that are making it difficult to solve this problem, one of them is misinformation about the nature of the problem. The Moroccan population has been convinced of a partial and erroneous version of the problem, which has nothing to do with a debate on the matter, because the official version would truly be difficult to defend, and anybody who expresses a different opinion is seen as somebody who is betraying the country. And this marginalizes and criminalizes minority sectors that are openly trying to defend independence, and they are being repressed. And this is reported through NGOs and other institutions that defend human rights in the area. And also the population, the Moroccan population now has the idea that the Sahrawis have privileges, that they are exempt from paying taxes, and this causes some ill will between the two populations. And this is exacerbated by campaigns that attempt to criminalize those who try to express themselves against what is happening. And we have to recognize that some very timid steps have been taken to try to modify traditional politics. Among them, there's a new National Council for Human Rights in Morocco, although these are not very active. I wrote to the president of the National Council of Human Rights in Morocco, asking him to provide to me information about some of the results achieved by the institution of these regional councils in El Ayoun and Daila. Unfortunately, I have received no response whatsoever from him. Another interesting thing was that this same council gave a suggestion to the king to eliminate military justice against civilians after 24 Sahrawis who were independence militants were unjustly sentenced. But the very fact that they were sentenced reveals that this policy of maintaining, of keeping the Sahara in these conditions continues. So many delegations from the parliament and Spanish journalists have been sent back at the El Ayoun airport. Recently, however, the authorization for Spanish parliament members to visit the territory and have interviews with activist organizations, this was agreed upon between the Spanish government and that of Morocco, seems to relax the rigidity of the situation a bit. Another positive element has been a joint visit of delegations of the youth of the Polisario Front and the Socialist Union of Popular Forces of Morocco together to the territory of the Sahara, also to the camps, the Tindouf camps, and this visit was organized according to an initiative by the Socialist International. However, recent words by the monarch don't offer much hope. He said that the situation is difficult, and so far nothing has been decided. The maneuvers of the adversaries against our territorial integrity will not stop, and this could put our cause mean that our cause is facing decisive developments. So this is something that not just Morocco does, demonizing the adversary, but this is really in the way of finding a solution. Another factor that needs to be borne in mind: is the Polisario Front a completely independent actor, or the fact that its base is in Algerian territory, does that have any effect? Morocco has always insisted, obsessively, I think, in the dependence of this movement on Algeria, saying that it has no personality of its own, that it's simply doing what Algeria wants. And it's true, we've seen in some of its decisions, especially when it was against or in favor of certain plans proposed by James Baker, that they seem to echo certain Algerian voices. But in the discussions with Morocco, it's its own voice that you hear. And they need to reach an agreement with them. There's a recent call for meetings by the Moroccan ambassador in Algeria after the President Bouteflika's and the African conference has called for solidarity. But so far, the Sahrawis hiding behind their neighbor, their Algerian neighbor, that are running the risk of disappearing. So Morocco has played with time, believing time was its main ally. They let years and years go by, but this makes it more and more difficult. They thought for some reason that this was a good strategy. But these are refugees who live in very difficult conditions, so they thought something there would yield. However, the time that has elapsed has caused new problems to appear, and this is now a new dimension to the problem, and it's a security problem. And this means that we need to find a solution to prevent the Sahara from sinking into this climate of insecurity that the Sahel region is going through. And we need a climate of confidence. But how can we create this atmosphere of confidence among two parties that reject each other? This historical experience in Morocco, is one where the vision of the importance of security has always been important. And so people have mistrust. And as I said, there's a good example. There's the visit of Christopher Ross to El Ayoun. He was taken by police forces. It was turned into a battlefield with wounded people were wounded, and it's a very complex problem, and its solution is not just merely a yes or a no by the population. We need to bear in mind the history of this conflict, especially the suffering of both peoples, the Sahrawi and the Moroccans. There was a meeting in Rabat in 1996 between a Moroccan delegation chaired by Mohammed, who was a prince at the time, he's the king today, and the Polisario Front, presided by Bashir Mustafa Sayed. Both sides recognized the sacrifices and suffering of the other, but without a change of discourse that allows us to recognize the reasons of the enemy, but also our own errors, our own mistakes, the mistakes made by both sides, it will be impossible to come together. Only self-criticism will allow them to find understanding. Years ago, a high-level Moroccan official was telling me that unless Morocco publicly recognized facts such as the bombarding with napalm of civilian Sahrawi populations since the exodus toward Tindouf in 1975, no solution would be found. And we could say the same about the Polisario Front, which for decades has had strict ideological control over the populations under it. And I think it will be unavoidable to have a referendum where the Sahrawis can freely express their will. And this is recognized even in the Moroccan initiative for the negotiation of an autonomy statute of 2007. The autonomy statute, the result of negotiations, will be subjected to a referendum by the populations concerned in accordance with the principle of self-determination and the provisions of the United Nations Charter. Could we conclude with all these political negotiations that there will be a statute for a democratic Sahara, perhaps linked to Morocco? We can have an international law. We have formulas like federalism, free associated state. In this meeting I referred to in 1996, the Polisario Front even talked about independence within interdependence, which I think is more than just a play on words. This referendum, if it achieves a political agreement, as President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, the former political prisoner from Morocco, Abraham Sarfati, he's now passed. But they referred to a solution where this area could be linked to Morocco through a negotiated solution within the framework and the support of international law. And this could bring to an end this conflict with no winners and no losers. But the solution of the problem means that there needs to be a return by the refugees. And these are difficult conditions to resolve for Morocco, which internationally would have had the right to conserve its territory, as well as for the other side, which would have achieved international recognition. Where can we find also the funds for such a huge program with humanitarian aid, which is now running low as a consequence of the world economic crisis? Morocco would need to talk about repatriation of tens of thousands of people, provide basic guarantees to allow for the construction of a democratic Sahara in a hypothetical democratic Moroccan federation. Thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry. I have some more. The Polisario, for the time being, does not seem to be willing to play this game. I think it would need guarantees that for now Morocco has not yet offered. And these guarantees need to include evidence that there is real democratization in the country. But this is not being shown by reality. And again, they would need to take steps to end the suffering of so many refugees with no tangible future, a new meeting, a re-encounter of families, a reunion of families that have been separated for decades. And Morocco needs to stop demonizing these people. And as I've said before, the Polisario Front, and I've said this before, but what I have said has not been very well received, needs to take a decisive step forward, not only for reconciliation with Morocco, but also it needs to contribute to set the foundation for the construction of a Maghreb of the regions that puts an end to rivalries for the hegemony that has characterized the recent history of this area since that unfortunate War of the Sands in 1963.
Thank you. Well, I would like to also thank the Center for organizing this meeting and for inviting me. It is very timely, considering, of course, the long impasse on the resolution of the conflict, and also because, as my colleague already mentioned, today is the 38th anniversary of the Green March when Morocco annexed the territory of Western Sahara. And we need to also remember that since that time, thousands of refugees have been living in the camps in the Tindouf area in Algeria. In 1991, the United Nations, under the responsibility of the Security Council, undertook the organization of a referendum of self-determination through a settlement plan, which was offering two options at the end, either integration with Morocco or independence. That means a winner-take-all solution. It has been 22 years since the settlement plan and the ceasefire between the two parties, the Kingdom of Morocco and the Polisario Front, went into effect in September of 1991. And MINURSO, the mission that was supposed to oversee all this work, was created. The conflict is still at an impasse, and the current personal envoy, Christopher Ross, just completed another round of visits in the region, where he explained to the parties and the neighboring countries, Algeria and Mauritania, his intention to take a new approach which would involve consultations with each side and subtle diplomacy rather than just continue holding meetings. Predictably, both sides agreed, but they reiterated their long-standing positions on the issue. I have been asked by the Center to address the prospects of the conflict's resolution and the role, if any, of the United Nations. Currently, we are at the same impasse that was created in April of 2004, when the Security Council weakened its support for the last proposal submitted by the United Nations in 2003, the peace plan for the self-determination of the people of Western Sahara, which had been prepared by the first personal envoy of the Secretary General, former Secretary of State James Baker III. In June of 2004, Mr. Baker resigned, telling the Secretary General Kofi Annan that after doing all he could, he had concluded that the conflict would not be resolved unless the parties were asked to do something that they would not voluntarily agree to do. However, the Secretary General, after accepting his resignation with regret, informed the parties, reassured them rather, that the UN would continue with its efforts to resolve the problem and find a solution. And of course, this continues being the case today. So what have we seen so far? Since the start of the UN's involvement in 1991, different Secretary Generals, the Secretariat, the various special representatives that headed MINURSO, and the personal envoys, with Mr. Baker's exception, have allowed the parties to control the process, and they succumbed to blockages and threats by both sides that they would walk out of the process if the UN did not meet their demands, their terms. At different times, both sides have stalled the implementation of the settlement plan and the search of solutions if they did not meet their objectives. In the case of Morocco is, of course, some kind of an autonomy under Moroccan sovereignty right now, or a referendum of self-determination for Polisario. Polisario did most of the blockades at the time of the identification process during the implementation of the settlement plan, for fear that MINURSO was approving too many Moroccan applicants, and because they did not have confidence that MINURSO was doing a good job. Morocco started blocking the process after the preliminary results of the identification were given to the two parties, and it saw that it was not really assured that the referendum would resolve in integration with Morocco. The Secretariat has tried to accommodate the two parties. However, there was never really a very clear strategy. It was never very clear what the aims were. At times, the Secretariat appeared more interested to continue the process than the parties themselves. So this has created a pattern that the Secretariat has been either unwilling or unable to break. Over 9 years now since Baker's resignation, we're at the same spot in terms of finding a solution. In addition, frustration has been building, and the geopolitical situation on the ground, both in Western Sahara and North Africa at large, has been changing, adding new worrisome dimensions at the conflict. We're talking about increased frustration by the young people in both sides due to the socioeconomic conditions, the Arab Spring in North Africa, and of course the creation of Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, which has added terrorism in the equation. Now, there are those who disagree, who say that the settlement plan was a legal document which could have been implemented. I disagree, and I say that the settlement plan was conceived as a political instrument, and that's how both the parties and the Security Council saw it and treated it. Now, turning to the role of the Security Council. The Council has been always very happy to hear good news, positive news, and solutions to technical problems, even if they did not really help resolve the overall conflict. It has been eager to approve solutions proposed by the Secretary General or the personal envoy, but has refused to take a firm position and even ask the parties to do something that they do not want to do, claiming, of course, that the conflict of Western Sahara falls under Chapter 6 of the United Nations. For those who are not familiar with the terminology, Chapter 6 means that any conflict that is under this chapter needs the cooperation of the parties to be resolved. The Security Council cannot impose a solution as it would under Chapter 7. After solutions were proposed by Mr. Baker and they would not be accepted by the parties and the Security Council, finally in 2003, he delivered the peace plan for the self-determination of Western Sahara, as the Council had requested him to do. A key aspect of the peace plan was a referendum of self-determination after 4 years of autonomy that had 3 options at the end: either independence, or integration with Morocco, or a continuous autonomy. The Security Council unanimously supported this plan by Resolution 1495 in July of 2003. However, in April of 2004, Morocco rejected the peace plan, basically because of the independence option. At that point, France, together with the United States and Spain, which was a rotating member of the Security Council at the time, persuaded the rest of the Security Council to retreat from the support of the peace plan and revert to strongly supporting a mutually acceptable political solution. Although in 2002, in February, the Council had been told by Mr. Baker that such a solution was not possible because the parties would not agree on anything mutually. Finally, in April of 2007, Morocco submitted its own proposal, and since then we have had 2 proposals on the table. Morocco's proposal offering a statute of autonomy to Western Sahara under Moroccan sovereignty, and Polisario's proposal, which was basically the Baker plan with guarantees to Morocco in the event of independence. The Moroccan proposal foresees negotiations with the Polisario Front to agree on the modalities for its implementation. However, autonomy under Moroccan sovereignty is the only outcome in this proposal after a referendum at the end. Now, the key feature of the Polisario plan is a referendum of self-determination with the 3 options under the Baker peace plan. Now, many of the functions and responsibilities of the local Saharan authority and even of the Moroccan state in the Moroccan proposal are not all that different from those in the Baker plan during the 4 years of autonomy. However, there is one key difference. Under the Moroccan proposal, the population will be asked to vote only on the final autonomy statute. There will be no choice of options. After Morocco submitted its proposal, the Security Council adopted Resolution 1754 in April of 2007, which has been the basis of the UN's work since that time. The resolution asks the parties to negotiate without preconditions with a view to achieving a just, lasting, and mutually acceptable political solution which will provide for the self-determination of the people of Western Sahara. In response, a series of meetings ensued, 4 formal, 10 informal, where no agreement really has come out of them, other than to continue meeting. And I can see problems with this resolution, which I believe explain why nothing has really happened. First of all, the resolution does not define the negotiations without preconditions. Therefore, each side interprets it its own way. It also calls for a mutually acceptable political solution which connotes compromise to satisfy both sides, which is contradictory to self-determination, which connotes choice by the people. And in calling for self-determination, the resolution overlooks that the Moroccan claim of sovereignty, which is not accepted by any state. So also, because the resolution calls the Moroccan proposal serious and credible, Morocco sees it as having primacy. Polisario, all that it matters for them is that their proposal is on the table and that the resolution talks about self-determination. However, we found out through WikiLeaks that when the Moroccan proposal was first presented to certain countries, to France, the United States, United Kingdom, and Germany, he was a member of the council at the time, in March of 2007 in Rabat, it was before giving it to the UN, they were not really impressed by the Moroccan proposal because they did not find that it really presented anything different to what Morocco had tried to convince Mr. Baker to accept when they were rejecting the peace plan before their final rejection. However, because Morocco insisted, they told Morocco to go ahead and present it to the UN. And then, of course, at France's suggestion, because France is the major supporter of Morocco in the Security Council, they called it serious and credible. Ignoring, of course, that Morocco was basically violating international law by claiming a sovereignty over Western Sahara. So where are we right now? As I mentioned before, exactly on the same spot where we were in June of 2004 when Mr. Baker resigned. The international civil society supports Polisario based on legal arguments and ignoring, of course, the political reality. Also ignoring or not knowing that despite professions to legality, Polisario was willing to divide the territory as it was suggested by Algeria in 2001. Polisario might have a legal case, however, Morocco has a political case. When personal envoy Van Walson briefed the Security Council in April of 2008, he asked for guidance after saying that nothing approaching negotiations had been happening in the meetings that he had chaired. The Council did not respond to his request, but they continue repeating the same language of Resolution 1754 in subsequent resolutions. In his recent visit to the region, personal envoy Ross proposed to the parties that he focus on elements that would respond to the two central aspects of the resolutions, of the Council's guidance, namely the substance of the political solution and the means of determining how the freely expressed will of the people will come about. I mean, he tried basically he will try to figure out this discrepancy of the resolution. The bottom line interest of both parties would have to be addressed and satisfied, but at the same time, both should recognize that they will not get everything they want. The Moroccans expressed uneasiness that there would be discussions outside their own proposal because their own proposal, of course, has primacy over that of Polisario. Polisario confirmed that they're willing to go along, but at the same time, they insisted that any solution will have to address, have a referendum that would address the inalienable rights of the people of Western Sahara. through a referendum with 3 options. So I personally see this as an omen that the parties plan to continue the way they have so far, because they both have reiterated their bottom lines, which are incompatible in the final outcome. And nobody's showing any sense of urgency to search or demand an early resolution of the conflict. As events have shown, the Secretary General has been reluctant to propose any solution of his own, and the Security Council even more reluctant to impose one. What purpose does continuation of the process serve when the parties to the dispute remain in their original positions? Have they shown any political will to do things differently? And I mean, as I said, we see an axiom of negotiations that you cannot have the mediator being more interested in the solution, ignoring the case of Western Sahara, because the parties seem to continue their merry way and the UN keeps trying. Is the continuation of the process anything else other than providing the parties with some cover vis-a-vis their internal constituents that the UN is doing something and does not abandon their responsibility towards Western Sahara? We have seen Morocco's constant efforts to humiliate Polisario and to remind everybody that its real argument is with Algeria and not with the separatists, as they call Polisario. This does not serve any purpose other than worsen relationship with Algeria, which is at an all-time low right now, and have the other side digging its heels. And Polisario's constant reference to legality of the position and the fact that it is being supported by the civil society does not really serve any other practical purpose. If the issue were to be resolved based on legal arguments, this would have happened already. The fact is that politics have played a key role, and anybody denying this simply denies reality and perpetuates the plight of the refugees already 38 years in the camps. Both sides need a face-saving solution. Now, there have been some reports recently, I don't know how accurate they are, that the Royal Advisory Council for Saharan Affairs, CORCAS, has proposed a return to the Baker Peace Plan with a 10-year autonomy period, then a referendum that include the options of integration with Morocco, independence, or a federal state. If this is true, it might be an opening for resolution. If not, I just see 2 options. The Secretary General, his personal envoy, could meld the 2 proposals, Morocco's and the one by Polisario, which is the Baker Plan, have the Security Council support it and demand that the parties find a way to compromise on second-best positions. Or the UN should pull back and tell the parties they're on their own until they are ready to make some real compromises. A political decision is needed right now, and it can only be taken by the Security Council and its key members. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you very much. And sorry, I sitting under this the air vent has taken my voice away, so I try not to croak. I think the Wilson Center should start providing blankets to its speakers. It's so cold under this air vent. I'm sure everybody else is frozen.
If you succeed with that, you get a medal. We have been asking for it
for blankets.
15 years.
Okay. Okay, I want to focus on 2 issues in this discussion. The first one is the issue of the autonomy plan and the Moroccan autonomy proposal, because I think it's time to recognize that the autonomy proposal, it's not what it's made out to be. That in fact that there is no autonomy proposal right now on the table. There is in fact a proposal for advanced decentralization, which is very different from an autonomy proposal. The second point that I want to make is to try to put this conflict in a broader framework of similar intractable conflicts that probably in the end are never going to have a clear-cut solution. And where the solution probably is going to find some nebulous modus vivendi among the parties, rather than, as Anne said, you cannot have, it's too late to have a solution based on legality. Too many things have happened to go back and pretend that one can, go to the beginning of this crisis and deal it with that way. Let me start with the autonomy proposal. One thing that was at the beginning of, quote unquote, the Arab Spring, when Morocco had its own very brief uprising, a lot of attention was focused on the fact that in Morocco, the king jumped ahead of the curve, essentially, and he proposed the new constitution. I think it's worthwhile going back and reading the speech in which the king proposed the new constitution. And that was in March of 2011, because that speech does not start talking about a new constitution. The key point of that speech is the proposal for advanced decentralization for Morocco. And that is really the key of what the king was proposing. Nobody paid any attention to it because everybody focused on the constitution, because at the end of the speech he also talked about a new constitution. And the new constitution was much more dramatic. Decentralization is kind of a boring topic. So the constitution seems much more dramatic. That was the promise of perhaps greater democracy in the country and so on. And of course the king set up then this committee to study the new constitution. But I think it's worthwhile to keep in mind that he started on decentralization and not on the constitution. What is planned for advanced decentralization? That has gone through various reiterations, has been the subject of all sorts of studies and so on. And this is a plan to move Morocco from this very centralized model in which the governors of the various areas are all appointed from the center, to a more decentralized system in which various regions and even local governments have a degree of self-government. They can elect their own officials and so on. This proposal is supposed to be implemented everywhere in the country. In other words, there are no provision made in this proposal for advanced decentralization for special degree of autonomy for the Sahara. And in fact, if you want to get Moroccan officials indignant, is to suggest that, even ask the question whether the Sahara would have a special statute, that whether there would be special provisions made. And the idea is not. The entire country is going to have the more decentralized system. The only concession that I can find in my conversation with officials, in the statements that have been made to the fact that the Sahara has a special problem, is that the decentralization will first be implemented in the Sahara. In other words, that's going to be the trial ground for that. But that's what makes me to conclude, essentially, that we keep on talking about an autonomy plan for the Sahara, and very frankly, I don't think it exists. I don't see any sign of it. Talking to people, I don't see it as existing. And I am not sure why we keep on insisting that we keep on discussing it, as in fact that there was this autonomy plan that provides, perhaps a solution. When Anne is talking about, the caucus and the sort of modification of the Baker plan and so on, what I think the Moroccan government is talking about is to implementing its advanced decentralization, that's what it's called, advanced decentralization plan in the southern, in the Sahara, prior to then, consulting with the population, essentially. In other words, it would mean making the Sahara for 10 more years, or at least for whenever it starts, integral part of Morocco, administers like all other Moroccan regions. Now, I have nothing against the decentralization. I think a lot of Arab countries could benefit from more decentralization. They are all highly centralized, decisions are all made in the capital, they are removed from the population and so on. But this is not an autonomy plan. And that is really the only point I am making here. So in that sense, I don't think it represents, what it suggests to me is that Morocco is even less willing to compromise than it was before on this point. I don't think Polisario is particularly willing to compromise. Certainly Algeria is not interested in compromising. I'm not trying to say one side is more rigid than another, but I'm just trying to point out that this sort of last perhaps shred of hope that the idea of autonomy offered, in fact, it's an illusion, because I don't see it as being there any longer. So I don't know exactly, where that leaves the situation, because it seems that all these discussions, what Anne was talking about, are still based on the assumption that there is going to be decentralization there. Now, there are two things here. One is that, that perhaps can be done, and I'm not, there are people who have spent a lifetime trying to negotiate the something there. I'm not one of them, and I would not presume to give advice. But it seems to me that if any, if these Caucasus ideas could work, a modification of the Baker Plan could work and so on, it would require an enormous amount of pressure by the UN and by the international community for Morocco to put forward a real autonomy plan. In other words, to try and detach, recognize that, the Sahara is different from other provinces. We are not that all provinces in Morocco could benefit from greater decentralization, but we are really talking about a special problem there. Whether or not it is possible, I do not know. The second point that I want to make, and I'll just bring it up very briefly because it's very complicated and certainly cannot, there is no time to develop this clearly, is that we are seeing more and more of these conflicts around the world now that cannot be solved on the basis of legality, essentially, because you can never recreate the status quo ante. There is no way in the case of the Western Sahara to decide really who are the people who had the right to vote in a referendum originally, who are the original inhabitants. It's a bit late to get to that. And that also creates a whole lot of other issues about, well, do the people who were moved down there by the government, the Moroccans who came from the north and who have settled there for a long time now, do they also have rights that need to be respected? But there is no way, in any case, to determine who are the people who had the legal right to vote if you go back to the beginning of the problem. We have a very similar problem in Iraq, the issue of Kirkuk. If you look at the constitution of the constitution of Iraq that was put in place under the U.S. supervision, essentially, it calls for a referendum in Kirkuk. But previous to the referendum in Kirkuk, it asked for the determination of who had the right to be, who was in Kirkuk before Saddam Hussein started moving people around. There is no way that determination is ever going to be made. It's because Saddam Hussein moved people around and the Kurdistan regional government moved people around, and I think there is no way of unscrambling that egg essentially at this point. And I think, and it's the same in the case, of the Sahara. So what we are seeing, and I'm just using two examples here, but what we are seeing more and more is these situations where not only there is no legal solution, but probably there is no clear-cut solution. There is no solution that and that perhaps what we are going to see more and more is these very ambiguous the situations developing around the world, where you have regions that are really not independent regions, where areas that wanted their independence but whose independence is not recognized, but are de facto becoming independent. I think in the case of the Sahara, unfortunately, it's going to be they are becoming annexed more than becoming independent. But essentially, what is determining the solution to this situation is really the facts that they develop on the ground, rather than issue of legality. I would argue it's not even politics. Yes, of course, politics is involved, but more than politics is the facts that have developed in the ground. It's the fact that people have been moved around willingly or forcibly over periods of decades, and that areas have been administering themselves. Take Somaliland and part of Somalia. Nobody is willing to recognize the independence of Somaliland. It has been functioning pretty much as an independent area for 2 decades, perhaps even more at this point. It's so. And I am afraid that what we are seeing in the Sahara is one more example of these situations that are just going to find their own solutions one way or another, that have nothing to do, unfortunately, with international legality, that nothing to do even with high principles. They are just having to do with the fact that nobody can find a solution. And I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marina. Let me put the first question to all three of you. Is there a strong Al-Qaeda presence in the Sahara? Is that something we should worry about, we should take into consideration, or not?
So strong presence.
Al-Qaeda.
Al-Qaeda. From what I understand, terrorism is really not in Western Sahara. Al-Qaeda has not moved there. There have been some incidents. Morocco, of course, has been always very much in a hurry to point out that, yes, of course, they are terrorists. Even when they had found some cache of arms there, it turns out they were just soldiers, that they were just dealing with it. So I wouldn't say, but of course, there's the possibility, of course, of always of some young person doing something crazy, being very frustrated. But I would say no, Al-Qaeda, I wouldn't worry about Western Sahara proper. Please.
I would worry a little more, not in the sense that I don't think that when the Moroccan government raises the issue, they have any solid evidence that Al-Qaeda is there. Or any of these other networks, because let's face it, when we talk about Al-Qaeda, we talk about all these different organizations, right, that are loosely affiliated to each other and to Al-Qaeda and so on. The problem is that we are dealing with a part of the world that goes to Mauritania on one side, to Sinai on the other, frankly, where you have all these networks affiliated to each other in ways that, frankly, we do not understand, and I really doubt very much that even intelligence agencies do, that are operating and that are better, they have become much better armed since the fall of Gaddafi because of all the arms that have come out of his arsenal. So essentially, although I certainly don't have any evidence at this point that Al-Qaeda is operating in the Tindouf camps or recruiting in the Tindouf camp. Maybe it is. I just don't have the evidence on that. I think we cannot say it's unlikely to happen because, unfortunately, in my opinion, it's all too likely sooner or later to start happening there as well.
Actually, one thing to add is that even before the actual creation of Al-Qaeda, we always worried in the UN about the border with Mauritania. That was always considered the underbelly of Western Sahara because we knew that when it came to the border with Algeria, you were sure that nothing could happen. The Algerians wouldn't allow anything. But the border with Mauritania, which is much, much longer, that is, and of course, given that there have been certain incidents in Mauritania, there would be some danger that something could happen from that area.
Estoy un poco con lo que dice Ana y también Marina.
But also with
No
Marina,
hay pruebas,
there is
pero a mí
no
lo que me preocupa
evidence.
es que
What
Marruecos
concerns me, though,
insiste
is that
en esa
Morocco
demonización
insists on this demonization of the enemy, of their opponents, in public opinion. This is what they try to do. This danger, in my opinion, is 30 million Moroccans who are ill-informed, who have been given half-truths or half-lies. And every day they build on is the press on the right and the left is doing this. So many young Polisario members have been found in Al-Qaeda. This is all lies. What could exist is the possibility that there are young people who are in despair after 38 years of Congress, and they might take some steps, and the Polisario front might try to ideologically control any kind of outbreak of fundamentalism, but this possibility always exists.
We're going to open the floor to
Vamos
your
a-
questions and so on. I don't know whether Mr. Ross is in the audience because
Yes,
I
he
saw
is.
he is. Because you were mentioned a number of times, would you like to say something?
No, I'm seeking wisdom.
Then you can have the first question if you want to think it. Okay. I thought in fairness, since you were mentioned, yes, the lady in the front and then here. I saw you. We'll get to everybody, please. But remember, I said questions, please, and brief questions. Sure.
Hi, my name is Nadine Hoffman. I'm the Director of Programs for the International Women's Media Foundation. And this is a very good policy of not taking comments, because if you've ever run an event on Western Sahara, it's very hard. But you have to be strict.
But we will have more meeting, but please, because we just have 15 minutes and lots of questions.
Yes, with that in mind, I just wanted to ask the panel if they
You
wanted...
speak a bit slower so they can interpret it.
Yes. I wanted to ask the panel if they had any thoughts on the role of lobbying in the resolution of this conflict. My organization has led a series of reporting trips of international journalists to both Moroccan-controlled Western Sahara and to the camps in Algeria. And we have some firsthand experience with how closely lobbyists are involved in shaping policymakers' ideas of what's going on there. I just wondered, and maybe this is something you'll cover in another session, but if you feel lobbying may affect the possibility of achieving a solution in Western Sahara.
Thank you. Great. Marina, you want to go first?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, in all these situations, there are interest groups involved, there are lobbies involved, pushing one way or another, trying to influence public opinion. Does it make the situation more difficult? Probably, because because lobbies, by definition, take very clear stands on certain things and therefore harden the lines of the conflict. That said, I don't know what we do about it, because it's not a problem that we can solve.
Anna, do you want to add something?
My own question is, no, lobbying has not helped in the case of Western Sahara, because all lobbying has done on both sides just harden the position of each side and make them feel basically that, yes, they have support, they are right, because they have people agreeing with them. I call it basically playing to the galleries. Both sides have been doing that. It hasn't helped to resolve the conflict in any way.
Vous voulez ajouter quelque chose?
Darle una opinión al público.
Un poco que añadir a lo que se acaba de
Just don't have that much to add what has been said, but yes, I agree. It does strengthen the position of each one of the parties. I remember an interview by Amos Oz a few years ago referring to the Palestinian conflict, and somebody said, I'd rather talk to a radical of any of the parties than to a lobbyist or an intermediary of the sort that supports one or the other side. I've had experience in Tindouf precisely talking to the Wali, the governor of the Dakhla camp. and people from NGOs didn't want to talk to me, and the Wali is saying, let Bernabé talk. We want to talk directly. Don't get in between us. So it just makes everything more complicated.
Dave Ottaway, a senior scholar here at the center. Professor Lopez Garcia, if I understood you correctly when you were referring to the camps in Algeria, you said somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000. Do we not know how many refugees there are in Algeria? And what is their legal status, and can they come and go? And are there refugee camps elsewhere than in Algeria?
Los varios campamentos que hay con los nombres de las principales ciudades del Sáhara Occidental, algunos muy separados, como el de Dakhla, está muy al interior, muy cerca de Mauritania. Los otros, digamos, más en torno al propio.
The other camps are close to the city of Tindouf. And these are huge, but there's no census that would allow us to know exactly how many people there are. So there are various estimates. The UN, through the organization in charge of refugees, must have its own estimate. I don't think they dare, though, to make any statements in this regard so that they're not seen as taking sides or having a specific position. And these are camps where there are controls on whether on coming in or leaving. There's really no real freedom to leave. And let's not forget what happens in the other part of the territory, where any step by any person requires an ID and control by the various levels of the security forces that control those coming in and those leaving the cities. But the condition of being a refugee, whether they live in tents made out of cloth or whether they live in brick housing, in any case, it's still a terrible, unbearable condition for any human being.
Because the problem has been with the camps that until the time that the
El problema ha sido con los
started
campamentos.
in 94 to 99, Polisario and Algeria would not allow any census by UNHCR, the refugees agency. So, and they were of course claiming that there were about 150,000 refugees, which was a hard number to believe, given that originally the census found, the Spanish census, 74,000 people, half of them left for Tindouf, the other half stayed in the territory. So from about 35,000 to reach 150,000, it was a bit hard to imagine. However, during the identification, they started like doing some calculations, extrapolating from the numbers that the people had come to be identified. The UN conclusion was more or less around 100,000 people. Of course, now that was at the end of 1999 when the identification was completed. I don't know at this stage what's happening because, of course, there are people coming and going, so nobody really knows what the real number is there. And as for people coming in and out, the territory is so inhospitable and so hard. So people in theory are free to go in and out, but the reality of it is that it's very hard. And of course, there are families that can return to Western Sahara. They have done so. And it's a very dangerous area. There are mines. So just the environment is such that moving in and out is very difficult.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, and then you. Yeah. Just wait for the mic, please, and brief question, please.
Muy buenos días, don Bernabé. I am Mohammed Baysat from Western Sahara.
Okay.
First, I want to thank Woodrow Center for this initiative. I'm very pleased to be in Woodrow Center.
Question, please.
Withdraw Center legacy is about self-determination. Before it became a United Nations issue, it was first a Withdraw Center issue of self-determination about colonial people.
But there is no room for information. I just would need a question,
Mhm.
please.
I understand your policy and I respect it.
There is no policy. There is because we
The
have
policy you
because
mentioned it.
5 minutes we have left, and there will be a series of meetings. Please.
Thank you very
One-
much.
Okay.
Whenever you can stop me whenever
Yeah.
your time
Can I
is
have
over.
a question? If you want to make a statement, I'm sorry.
If you allow me, I will make the question.
Would you please ask a question?
What is it possible, Mr. Bernabe Lopez, to have an autonomous region in a dictatorial regime? Is that possible in a country where there is no democracy or no respect of human rights? Is it possible that we have a democratic autonomous region?
Thank you.
Second,
One question.
no, I have another question to me.
I'll get back to you.
All
again.
right, thank you.
Mr. Lopez.
Desde luego, esa es una
Of
pregunta
course,
clave.
that is a key question.
Sin democracia no hay
Without
autonomía.
democracy, there is no possible autonomy. Morocco is not currently a democratic regime, and I've mentioned that the 2011 constitution missed an opportunity to move forward in the democratization process. There's a stagnation, even a little bit of a regression in the democratic process in Morocco. It's a particular type of dictatorship, but we have to be aware of certain subtleties. But there's a difference in how people live in the Western Sahara and how people live in the rest of the country. There's greater freedom in the north of Morocco, even though freedom of the press is truly being attacked. And in the case of Alianusla, we saw how there was just an excuse, and a website that had an online newspaper that was critical to the regime was forced to shut down. So that is a key matter, undoubtedly. And in my presentation, I tried to allude to that. There will be no autonomy unless there is a democratization of the country. And naturally, as Marina Ottaway was saying when she talked about the fact that there's no credible autonomy plan, she's absolutely right. There's a piece of paper with promises on it, but nothing has yet come out of these promises to make them a reality.
Yeah, I'd like to add something. Frankly, I don't quite agree. I mean, if your question is, can you have an ideal democratic autonomous region in, the answer is no. If you look at the facts at what happens in some areas, Iraq is not terribly democratic. Kurdistan is not terribly democratic. Kurdistan is an autonomous region. So I think it is possible to have a degree of autonomy. Whether it's desirable or not is something else, but I don't think you can jump to the conclusion that there can be no autonomy unless you have real democracy.
Anna,
Okay, no one pass.
question here, please. Yes, and then we'll can you wait for the mic, please? Thank you. And identify yourself. Thank you.
Hi, Eric Goldstein, Human Rights Watch. Dr. Ottaway, you said that the legality has been bypassed by facts on the ground and the rapport de force, and it's better not to keep referring back to legalism. Is the logical extension of that we should give up on the notion of self-determination for the Sahrawi people? Because while all the parties pay lip service to that, including Morocco, although they define it as a choice between full integration and autonomy. As the panelists pointed out, there's been a great deal of colonization and populations are all mixed up together. So however can we get to any kind of consultation with the Sahrawis as a people? I don't think the autonomy plan or the decentralization plan refer to consulting the people, the Sahrawi people, as opposed to the people who happen to live in Western Sahara today.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, frankly, it's going to be, in principle, yes, it is the Sahrawi people who should be consulted. I don't think we can determine who are the people who need to be consulted. I mean, the theory is simple. I think in practice, I don't think it is possible. Do I believe that the original inhabitant of Kirkuk should be consulted? Yes. Are we going to be able to determine who they are? No. That's all I'm saying.
Do you want to add something?
My position is very similar in that sense, that because exactly the facts are such right now that we're talking about starting with a census of 74, working on that census, and finally coming up with something in 1999. That was when the identification finished. That had more or less identified the people that should be voting for the referendum. That was how many years? Yeah, 11 years ago. 14 years ago. So how, if we're going to hold a referendum at this age, some voting, how in God's name is that going to be held, and how much time will it take to figure out who is going to vote? I mean, it's got to be some different formula if we're going to go for a popular consultation, which I don't know what that might be at this stage.
Yes, please.
Hi, yes, my name is Gareth Smith. Thank all the panelists for your excellent presentations today. I'm with the law firm Foley Hoeg. I share a bias that you may or may not share, which is rule of law. And I've heard several people say, well, there's the rule of law, but we'll have to throw it out because it doesn't seem to be working. I formerly served as the U.S. representative at the UN Human Rights Commission. We are a country of rule of law. We like to think that the international community is rule of law. And the question is, would not tossing aside the rule of law set a terrible precedent, whether it's Kosovo or Iraq or elsewhere around the world? Should we not try and find a way to embrace the rule of law and hold the ICJ opinion and hold Morocco to the rule of law?
Thank you. Who wants to take it?
I agree with you that it's not a question of tossing aside the rule of law, but it's a question of the political reality has been that in real terms, that's exactly what the international community has done. They pay lip service to the rule of law and the self-determination, but in reality, this has not happened because when Morocco annexed Western Sahara in 75, and then the United Nations and the Security Council went on to say, oh yes, self-determination, we're going to do this and that, and the settlement plan, in reality, none of this was happening, and nobody ever made an effort to make it happen. So at this stage, by, of course, citing the rule of law, all we're doing was just simply extending the situation as it is, the status quo. So, I mean, if there is any way that you can propose that the rule of law can be implemented and we tell Morocco, get out of Western Sahara, fine. Fine.
Okay. Professor Lopez.
Efectivamente no se trata de
Yes, in fact, it's not about casting aside the possibility of rule of law. We have to try to get Morocco, first of all, to be a country where the rule of law is respected. But reality has changed a lot in these last 38 years. And we cannot fossilize the possibility of reaching a solution. We haven't exhausted all the possibilities yet. We have never Sahrawized the matter. Neither Polisario nor Morocco want to Sahrawize it. Sahrawis, whether they live here or there, to have them talk together. Polisario doesn't want that. They even reject the possibility of using as interpreters people they consider traitors because they had lived in Morocco for 10 years. And there are people who struggle on a daily basis for their people and for a solution within Morocco, for a dignified solution, which is still not clearly defined. And their names, their people who have been mediators at key crisis times, and they've been accused of being traitors before public opinion in Morocco. So there's a greater possibility than the ones mentioned by Polisario in its demands. And these possibilities can be leveraged by the interpreters who, on the Polisario side or on the Morocco side, can help, but also those elements of Sahrawi civil society, young people, new interpreters who can also cooperate. So I think this would be in accordance with international legality if they came to a possibility of a consensual agreement and have a vote of the population concerned for this final decision. And I think this would allow us to feel that we're abiding by international law. And it would be difficult, but we would consult those people who were in the 99 census. I don't know if the effort of a new census would be excessive, but in any case, a consensus needs to be reached. I think that's an interesting possibility. And that's why I'm saying it's not a matter of just saying yes or no. I think yes to territorial integrity, yes to independence, it's too simple. It's too simple. There are other ways to help these people with their self-determination.
William Zarpin from SAIS. Question to Professor Lopez. Spain knows something about autonomy. It's nothing but autonomy, 17 autonomous districts. You might call that decentralization. What does the experience of Spain in autonomy tell us? How can it help achieve autonomy in the Western Sahara?
Es una pregunta muy difícil de contestar porque
Question
España
to
vive
answer,
ahora
because
mismo
Spain right now is going through a significant problem. It needs to clarify its political system. Spain, with the 17 autonomous entities, and these have exercised their autonomy with a rather large margin to make decisions by the citizens themselves. But an impasse has been reached in a conflict between one of the regions, one of the most powerful regions, also in terms of the population, in terms of wealth, the traditional wealthy region of Spain, which received millions of immigrants coming from the rest of Spain and entering this community, this autonomous community, which is Catalonia. And there has been a poor management between the leaders of Spain and the leaders of Catalonia. There's been a political confrontation. They've been clumsy in the way that they've dealt with it. And right now, there's a sort of wrestling match going on, trying to clarify this. So from my perspective, Spain's experience has some very positive aspects in terms of the possibility of decentralizing in an effective way, but there are some limits. Perhaps in Spain, in some cases, we've gone over those limits, and that's why maybe we're paying now for the mistakes that have been made in this regard. I think if we were to apply to Western Sahara any lessons from Spain's experience, I want to mention briefly that meeting where Bashir Mustafa Sayed was talking to the future King Mohammed VI and the plenipotentiary minister at that time in 1996. Bashir Mustafa Sayed said, "Are you talking about autonomy or are you talking about decentralization? Autonomy sounds better to my ear, but what do you put in autonomy, inside of it? That is to mean, what authorities, what powers can an autonomous government have? That's the question about real democracy. What do we put inside this basket of autonomy? How do we fill this up so that it convinces the other side? Filling it up with guarantees, not with anything, just words, so like the ones that are written on the 2007 autonomy plan. Real guarantees." Me temo.
We started with you, Professor Lopez. we ended with your statement. Thank you very much for coming here. Join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, c'était très intéressant. Et, nous allons essayer de traduire votre texte.